So I think what I'll do is welcome everyone. This is a session on partnership and resilience, planning for austerity. Uh, and I'm Valerie Preston, and it's my pleasure to chair this session, but fortunately, you're not going to have to hear a lot from me. Uh, we have four speakers today. The first will be John Shields, who's a professor emeritus from Toronto Metropolitan University. And John is going to do an overview of the current situation in which immigrant serving agencies find themselves. Our colleague Jill Hanley, who is a professor of social work at McGill University, is going to talk about some lessons regarding partnership that we learned during the pandemic in Quebec. Louisa Varonis, who is the chair of Immigration and Franco-Ontarian Communities at the University of Ottawa and a professor of geography, is going to talk about how Ontario's réseau en immigration francophone navigate constraints and opportunities in a minority context. So what lessons can we learn about how to deal with austerity from them? And Tara Bedard, who many of you may know from Waterloo Region, is going to talk about the collaboration within her LIP about protesting austerity. But before they all speak, I need to do a few housekeeping things. First and foremost, you can use captions. If you look at the bottom of your screen under More, you open More, you will find it says Captions. Click on that, and you will be able to set up the captions you want to view the transcript. The second thing is the organizers have asked, could you please leave your cameras on? Um, now, I may be a retired university professor, but I know that nobody wants to put their camera on. But they have asked that you please leave your camera on and turn off your audio until you speak. We're going to have the presentations in a row, so hold your questions. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for questions, not the chat. So the Q&A button. And if once we've had all the presentations, you can always raise your hand. I may need some help from Micheline, who is the P2P person, to keep track of the hands. And we're really looking forward to having a conversation. So we're going to give the speakers, John and Jill, about 16, 18 minutes, and the same for the other two. So there should be plenty of time for questions at the end. Okay? And I'm not going to ask you for questions yet. Uh, so, okay, John, do you want to start? Uh, John
Yeah,
is going to talk about uh, an overview of the preparing for austerity on the part of the settlement sector. Oh, and the last thing I need to warn you about, this session is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the P2P website. All right?
great. Thank you so much, Valerie, for that introduction. And what I'm going to try to do to lead off is to set forth the broader context for this overall session by addressing the idea of resilience and the importance of partnership in the context of an environment marked by the headlong rush into austerity. In so doing, I'm going to also try to at least very briefly situate LIPs and RIFs position within this shifting landscape. So let me start then with austerity. And I think what we're currently witnessing is the movement from the promise during the pandemic crisis to build back better, and for government funders on their part, that meant to invest in sustainable settlement and social supports, to be transparent, and to meaningfully partner with community, and that this really has been abandoned to the current agenda for migrant newcomers to settle on less and for nonprofit settlement agencies to unilaterally absorb deep cuts to programming and funding. Um, and that means officially greater than actually a 15% cut to settlement services. That's about $320 million, probably more actually in the end. And of course, that's seriously jeopardizing many agencies' ability, and especially I would note here the smaller and mid-sized organizations to continue to operate in the service of vulnerable migrants. And agencies, I remind us, that are already underfunded and that have had their capacity significantly weakened during the pandemic. And also at a time when there's increasing demand for services. So not very opportune sort of situation for them, obviously. And this is taking place under the deliberately misleading labels as outlined in the federal budget of, and I'll just put in quotation marks here, as they say in the budget, modernizing government operations. And another phrase that's used is shifting from reliance to resilience. And this is simply code for imposing government cuts and austerity. Also, this is being done in the context of so-called excessive numbers of migrants being falsely blamed for societal affordability problems like inflation, high housing costs, and challenges with respect to access to healthcare practitioners. The idea being that cutbacks and austerity are the necessary remedy for this. Funding cuts also come with restructuring, including deep cuts to IRCC staffing, program reductions and elimination, reduction in eligibility to settlement programs, especially for economic migrants, which I think is quite troubling, and perhaps even a movement towards the use of user fees or co-payments for some programs and classes of immigrants. And this is already being done with respect to provinces around healthcare payments for refugees. Formally, austerity is an exercise in government cuts and belt tightening expressed as prudence and responsible financing. But austerity is not neutral. It's about prioritizing certain values over others, particularly neoliberal notions of the need to shrink the state, narrow notions of efficiency, the virtue of balanced budgets and lower taxes, and the efficacy of business values, in contrast to values such as equity, community, the ethic of mutual aid, and quality public services. In such an austerity calculation, the idea of settlement services as necessary investments in newcomers, facilitating social and economic integration, is discounted in favor of narrow, short-term views of the fiscal benefits of cuts. Ultimately, austerity is about transferring responsibility downward, and in the case of immigration, about settling on austerity. In other words, settling on less. Resilience and partnerships. Let me say a few words about that. So, austerity is reliant on resilience, but on a neoliberal version of resilience centered on the ability of individuals, families, and communities to be able to resiliently, if you will, endure. And for nonprofit service providers to continue to do ever more with less as capacity dwindles, but demands increase. In this environment, partnerships with government have been cast as one-sided business market-based relationships forged through competitive contracting. By contrast, a progressive notion of resilience, what we tend to refer to here as social resilience, contests the status quo, promoting a social justice, community-oriented approach for partnering for change. Social resilience is about community building, equitable partnering, and providing a welcoming environment. It recognizes the importance of institutions and the services they provide in facilitating sustainable forms of resilience, as was in evidence in the coming together of so many parties and organizations in the spirit of mutual aid during the pandemic, to build back better in partnership. As well, it involves the importance of services with voice, the key role of supporting immigrants and amplifying their voice in community and policy. Services and advocacy, after all, do in fact go together. Now, let me just end by just saying a couple words about LIPs and RIFs. And I think it's not insignificant to note that LIPs were actually born out of an earlier period of government austerity under the Harper Conservatives. In that case, it was an effort by the government to generate greater efficiencies in the settlement sector by focusing on outcomes through enhanced information sharing and connecting civil society and government actors at the local level to foster greater cooperation and more impactful partnerships and perhaps some funding out of local authorities. In part by getting nonprofit providers as well to do more with less through greater and ever more greater efficiencies. And LIPs and RIFs as place-based local institutions, I think have really played a necessary and a positive supportive roles over time. And especially, I think that's noteworthy during the COVID crisis, where we really see this, really shining. Now, at this stage, we don't know what funding austerity will mean for LIPs and RIFs going forward. But as autonomous actors and voice organizations, I think they have a critical role to play in what Okazi's Debbie Douglas, in a call to action, has termed the need to move beyond austerity and build a resilient future for our sector. And I'd encourage people to read Debbie's blog on the Okazi website. So I think it's a time for this to use the voice function of the settlement sector, because I think there's some real challenges coming out of this austerity agenda. And let me stop at that point there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And now we're going to hear from Jill Hanley, who is going to talk about what we learned about partnership and its value in Quebec during the pandemic. Thanks, Jill.
Thank you very much. I will share my slides. One moment. Sorry. So I am going to share with you today some reflections on how the Quebec settlement sector was able to use their position as sort of recognized, it's a term in Quebec, autonomous community actors, and how their position as these types of organizations during the pandemic allowed them to respond in a very, I mean, we can call it resilient way, and respond quickly. So I'm going to share our findings around this. So just to repeat, I think you've probably heard a bit about this before, but with the BMRC, we conducted surveys of settlement organizations in Quebec and Ontario about what happened during the pandemic. So I just want to recognize that. You can see a bit about our methods there. But the really interesting thing that came out now that we're a few years later is thinking about the role of autonomous action. And in Quebec, as of 2001, the government has had something called the Secretariat for Autonomous Community Action and Social Initiatives. And basically, there's a law that recognizes that community organizations have a role in Quebec politics, basically, in holding the government accountable and also taking action to respond to needs and issues independently of the government. And if, it's sort of a paradox here, but if you're recognized as autonomous by the Secretariat, then you can have access to a modest amount, but enough for a staff person at least, of core funding for your organization. So it gives some security to community organizations and recognizes that it is part of their role to be political critics. So in order to fit into this framework, organizations have to be nonprofits, they have to have a community membership and like a community board, they have to have a democratic life, and that their mission and their activities have to be sort of determined by their members and this community board. And like I said, this allows them to have core funding to pursue that kind of critical role and an acceptance that it is normal for community organizations to be critical of the government um, in a way that shouldn't automatically, put their funding at risk. This is the ideal. So leading into the pandemic, if we're looking at the role of settlement organizations, the TCRI, which is Quebec's equivalent of OCASI or any provincial level settlement coalition, it has 152 members from across the province, and most of their members would be recognized as autonomous by the Sakai. The other thing that's really interesting is that Quebec also has a very systematic presence of neighborhood councils that bring together intersectoral community organizations that meet regularly to kind of plan for their neighborhood, how things will go. And then these neighborhood councils on a sectoral basis build up provincially. I know there's equivalents in other provinces, but in Quebec, it's very systematic and it's recognized by the government as these are the normal interlocutors for different types of decision making. So then when the pandemic hit, what did this mean for the response of settlement agencies? So of course, like elsewhere in the early days, there's a lot of fear and uncertainty when the pandemic hit. And also very rapidly recognition. I know this is the case all over that newcomers, immigrants, refugees, undocumented people, precarious status, they were among the most vulnerable to COVID exposure and also the more serious impacts health-wise, but also impacts on their work and that type of thing. They were also really disproportionately among the essential workers. So, right away, the settlement groups were feeling that it was clear that they were going to have a big role to play in helping to protect their population. But uh, it was a little rougher in Quebec. It hit us hard health-wise, and the lockdown was very heavy in Quebec. It happened early, a stay-at-home lockdown. We had curfews in Quebec that, as far as I know, were not present anywhere else. And there were heavy fines for anyone, businesses, organizations, individuals who did not respect the rules. It Interestingly though, it these measures ended earlier than in some other provinces. For example, kids were home from school in Quebec easily 6 months longer than they were. I mean, kids were home from school in Ontario easily 6 months longer than they were in Quebec. So played out slightly differently, but pretty heavy. The thing that is really remarkable to me and in our research was that, only 1 week after the lockdown was declared in Quebec, it was declared March 13th, the lockdown in Quebec. 1 week later, TCRI made a press conference where they declared themselves essential services. It, it, it's hard to even accept. Like, this was a huge deal because, first of all, 1 week is not very long to get your members all on the same page. They had been trying to communicate with their counterparts in immigration to get a sense of this, and the government had sort of made this announcement that only essential services could remain open, and this was pretty much defined as health services and food services or like essential public services. And by declaring themselves unilaterally essential services, they were taking a gamble because if the government pushed back on them, all of their members could be fined for remaining open. But they pushed forward with this, and actually, what we've heard is they didn't hear anything from the government still for like months and months and months after this. But by making this public declaration, it allowed the settlement organizations in Quebec to have a very different response than what we see in most other provinces. So what happened because of that? They made the decision that they were going to remain open to serve their most vulnerable clients. Now, they did introduce hybrid services, but there was still like the doors were open in settlement agencies across Quebec for the most part across the province. And they were able, because of their funding model from MIFI, that's a little less rigid than the IRCC funding model, they were able to kind of take their budget and decide how to spend it to, for example, adjust the physical nature of their offices, spend money on outreach and stuff like this, they could more quickly shift their activities to respond to the actual situation. And they were very actively involved in their community council activities to assess the local needs around COVID, to do outreach to the population. And the TCRI members were like critical public health partners across the province, where there was often a recognition. I should say locally, there was recognition of the need for translation services, although it's notable that the Quebec government refused to put resources into translating COVID materials and left that responsibility to community groups. But TCRI members stepped up and worked with, for example, the Montreal Public Health Department to make translated materials widely available. So they ended up playing a really critical and active role in the response while keeping their doors open. I'm not going to get into too much detail around the kind of statistical outcomes of our survey, but just a couple of major highlights was that generally the staff relations reported by the managers and by the workers themselves in the settlement agencies were stable or improved over COVID. There was a sense of like shared mission and like pride in what they were doing, that it was important. Only 33% of Quebec settlement agency managers reported having to lay off employees, and that contrasts strongly with 100% of the Ontario settlement agencies that we spoke with who had to lay off employees, and only 37% of Quebec agencies shifted online, entirely online. Most of them had some. That's very different again from Ontario. During COVID, 96% of Quebec agencies were actually able to apply for new funding related to COVID to help them respond to the situation. So they actually increased their funding during this time. I can say for my own organization, the Immigrant Workers Center, we tripled our budget during this time, and it hasn't gone down since. So there's been like a recognition of the critical nature of these groups. 59% of agencies increased their services and only 14% decreased. So, maintenance of like important services to immigrant communities during this critical time. So overall, we can see committed and resilient management and frontline workers, that people were just looking for solutions and willing to be on the front lines to do so. While, there was a lot of concern in our survey and like effort made towards, for example, health and safety on the job for people while they're doing this. They weren't trying to risk their employees' lives or anything. They were able to rapidly adjust. I still can't believe that it only took them a week to decide we're going to go forward and make this independent announcement. The workers overall happy with how things turned out, and felt that their relationship with management was positive through all this. And I think we see overall that Quebec was served well by the flexibility in the funding model. And also, they had a mandate already to serve a broader clientele. So, still today, Quebec organizations are funded to, they're not well funded to, but it is permitted with the MIFI funding to serve more than permanent residents. They can also serve international students. They can serve temporary foreign workers. Basically, anybody with a temporary resident permit can receive basic services from settlement organizations, although not the individualized accompaniment that permanent residents get. So thank you. We wanted to offer that example, following up on John's a presentation of sort of looking forward of austerity, about the difference it can make when organizations have a sort of independent and autonomous frame of action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill. And we don't hear a lot about what's happening in Quebec outside Quebec, so this is really helpful. And Louisa, following up on that, we're going to hear from Louisa Veronis, who is the chair of Immigration and Franco-Ontarian Communities at the University of Ottawa, where she is also a professor of geography. And she's going to talk about a balancing act, how Ontario's RIFs navigate constraints and opportunities in a minority context. It's all yours, Louisa.
OK, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Ma présentation sera en anglais, mais je peux répondre aux questions en français. So I'm presenting in English, but the slides are in French, and I'm presenting in English, and I can answer questions in both languages. So thank you very much, Valerie, for organizing this session. So this is something new for me, and what I tried to do was to reflect on the emergence and evolution of the réseau in light of discussions we've had around resilience, partnerships, and now the sort of new context of austerity, and giving you a different example of how this works out. So a little bit of context on Francophone immigration first. Francophone immigration is different from sort of the, I guess, mainstream Canadian immigration. Is also different from immigration to Quebec. It's immigration into historic, linguistic, minority communities that are recognized as official language minorities, and it's within this broader context of mainstream Anglophone community, because these Francophone communities outside of Quebec are relatively small demographically, and their vitality is quite fragile, because due to sort of the dominant immigration system, their demographic weight has been declining over time, as you can see in the graph on the slide. So in the early 2000s, through concerted efforts from minority communities, the federal government recognized Francophone immigration as a strategy to maintain Francophone vitality, and this was done through main instruments, one known as La Cible, the target of 4.4%, representing the demographic weight of Francophone communities outside of Quebec at the time, and also the creation of the réseau that appeared actually before the LIPs. So this is something important, and based on what John said earlier, the RIFs didn't come out of the austerity from the Harper government. Rather, they emerged from this community horizontal governance that exists within the Francophone communities. So a little bit of historical context on the Francophone communities, where you could say have a perpetuous austerity because of the minority status, and had to struggle throughout the 20th century to have even basic services. So Francophone communities as a minority are generally in a situation of constantly having to face limited resources for their needs, and have historically been forced to develop their own infrastructure relying on community structures, community bases. So a little bit more on that. So here in relation to what we're discussing, there's kind of a paradox of the minority context, where they are in a disadvantage of lacking resources, being fairly invisible, competing within this mainstream Anglophone system, yet their minority status opens some opportunities, like specific types of funding that the federal government is providing them, even though generally they're below the actual needs. So here's this tension between this disadvantaged position in relation to some of the advantages as a recognized minority, that the levers for collaborative innovation that I will discuss. So sort of the questions guiding this is, how did the RIFs, the réseau, in this context of double minority, become models of social or collaborative community resilience in the face of perpetuous austerity, and how do they manage to use these levers of structural constraints to make them into strategic opportunities towards transformative resilience. So a little bit on background on Francophone communities that historically were mostly traditional communities, rural, so focus more on agriculture and organized around the Catholic Church. And throughout the 20th century, they had to modernize. The second half of the 20th century, they modernized, and in Francophone literature, we've been speak of mondialisé, globalized, so to speak. And in that transition away from a traditional church-based society, they had to create institutions, mostly community organizations, often linked with the public sector. So in the 20th century, we speak of l'autonomisation, I guess the road to become autonomous of Francophone communities, and long struggles to access services in French in the fields of education, health, justice, social services, arts and culture. And then this became a struggle in the 21st century to also have their immigration. So Francophone immigration is a result of this community struggle that was ongoing since the 20th century to become more autonomous. And underlying all of this is the notion of institutional completeness from Raymond Breton, who uses it for ethnic communities, but also like immigrant communities, but also for national minorities. It's a more of a normative logic around creating formal institutions, but within the Francophone minority context, there's a constant issue of incompleteness, as they never manage to achieve full completeness, and it's ongoing struggle for that. So others speak of the model that has been developed through the Francophone communities as community governance, and the other term used often exchangeably is collaborative governance. Within Francophone immigration, Paquet and Andrew use collaborative governance, so that's the term I will use. So now, what about this community governance? What is really important is that the model is very distinct. So the origins, the source of these community governance is different from the LIPs or from the rest of the settlement sector. And this is something really important to stress in this context, but we can still obviously learn a lot. That's why we're discussing it. So importantly, for the Francophone immigration itself is the result is an outcome of the struggles, as I mentioned, from Francophone communities, and was a result of horizontal governance that the Fédération des communautés francophones et acadiennes, the national body that represents Francophone communities, developed in consultation, collaboratively speaking with organizations that represent the different Francophone communities across different provinces and territories. So even Francophone immigration itself is the result of this community effort that is anchored in horizontal relationships within Francophone communities after decades of work to manage to get all the different services they needed. And so they put forward in the early 2000s, when the Francophone immigration became sort of an official strategy, they put forward, so this was an initiative from the FCFA to create local networks, réseaux, in order to basically create out of nothing a settlement sector for Francophone services. So this is very different from the LIPs that we created out of the 2005, I guess, signing of the Ontario agreement, and then put in place in 2008, when there were services, settlement sector already existing, even though itself maybe it may have come from community initiatives, but it was already there. Whereas the réseaux were put in place to actually develop a settlement service in French. And so from the start, there were horizontal relationships that enforced interactions among the existing actors, and basically forced more intense collaborations from the very, very beginning. So the origins are quite different from the réseau compared to the LIPs. So there are other networks I will discuss more shortly, but the FCFA from the beginning, put in place a number of initiatives, including, I guess, reflection days annually to think about this, and that's the start also of the academic research around this. So quickly, what's the evolution here, Francophone immigration and the role of the LIPs. So before the early 2000s, this kind of pioneer era, there were some services, mostly within Francophone institutions, or very few bilingual organizations that already existed. In the early 2000s, we really see a period of mobilizing, awareness raising, planning, development of infrastructure and services that were quasi non-existent. A period of struggle, and that's austerity that John referred to under the Harper era, where Francophone organizations had to also be in competition with the Anglophone organizations that were generally larger, more established, had more budgets, had more services. And there was also intra-Francophone competition for clients and funding, and the additional struggle of a minority context of lacking community spaces, being invisible, trying to reach out to Francophone immigrants, and so on and so forth. So additional challenges in that era. 2018 is a turning point, particularly with the funding of the Welcoming Francophone Community Initiative that I will discuss a little later. So this was new funding specifically dedicated, also created new partnership opportunities. And obviously this era coincides with the pandemic and the challenges that Jill already mentioned. And since 2023, we really see, I guess, a stabilization period, in part due to new policy changes with the modernization of the official language law, the establishment of a real Francophone immigration policy, and new pilot projects. So this is kind of a roadmap. Quickly, the focus here is on the three RIFs in Ontario, with whom I'm more familiar, and glad to see Catherine Saint-Hilaire being with us. So Ontario has three different RIFs that have started around 2004, 2007, that have been working together in sort of kind of a model collaborations in spite of different regional differences, both in the communities, the size, the density, the types of services available, and the types of immigration. They hold an annual forum jointly that rotates across the regions. They have multiple joint projects, and they generally have open consultations and learn from each other, feeding into their development. So Paquet and Andrew did a study to, I guess, assess the impacts and the results of the Ontario RIFs in 2014, and they published this in 2015. And in their work, they distinguished two types of outcomes or results. Some of the tangible results, so recognizing more services, more data collection, more knowledge, coordination, reduction in duplication of services, but they focus in particular on another type of outcome or result, which is a process and a practice of adaptation. And this is the transformative potential that the RIFs show increased levels of adaptation, awareness raising. There was increased confidence among all of the actors, increased engagement, generally consensus processes, joint understandings of what participation is, and generally joint capacity to enact action. So they stress these two types of results, and sort of the process and practice of adaptation is embedded in the RIFs. They also found some tensions that I'll skip. So here what's important is the dynamics of the processes and the practices in the field, and this is sort of the transformative potential, the resilience, the adaptation that I wanted to stress. So I'm not sure if I'm running out of time. I didn't put the timing, but I guess this was sort of the core what I wanted to say, to summarize, I guess more to reflect the comparative advantage of being in a minority context is that official minority communities have access to specific fundings that the federal and some provincial governments put in place. One characteristic is they have very, very strong social capital and very tight networks that facilitate innovation, maybe compared to the larger and more sort of many more different actors within the Anglophone communities. So the community mobilization can generate concrete outcomes, particularly in the form of federal government investments. So here's where the welcoming Francophone communities is important. This was massive investment that in fact contributed to feeding into creating more partnerships and more spaces and more areas of consultation targeted to the specific needs of the communities. So originally 14 communities got this funding, and this increased to 24. Another example of concrete impacts that generated really innovation and again a feedback loop is a point d'accueil francophone, which is the result of 10 different organizations working together, and it creates an entry point for francophone immigrants to find all the other services. So again, creates more collaborations, more partnerships, more opportunities to discuss. And francophone communities have are somewhat protected even during periods of austerity where the funding cuts are never complete. Not as total. So there are some lessons here for the sector in terms of adaptive resilience and how the RIFs, by having these very strong collaborations and social networks, are able to create innovation and the importance of community governance in creating sustainable partnerships that can have real impacts, and so overcome the minority context limitations to generate funding and more opportunities, and how this can maybe be leveraged. Okay, so I had some more information, but I think I've said sort of the main points. Still in the current context right now, a new report by the Novel Observatoire en Immigration Francophone, who did a survey on resilience among the sector, found the ongoing challenges, particularly around funding from the public sector, from the government, and turnover, mental health, and just feelings of uncertainty. The fact that ongoing changes in immigration policy and settlement policies and institutional incoherences and in sort of incoherences between policies, particularly in a francophone context, are creating a lot of challenges, and then recognizing ongoing competition. And for francophones, attention, because I didn't mention this, the RIFs are not only there to coordinate services and create those partnerships, they have the additional role of attracting francophone immigrants. So this is on top of everything else they have to do. So just a few spaces for concerted dialogue collaborations. So the Fédération offers a number of avenues, including an organization where the, porte-parole, the organizations representing the different francophone communities meet to discuss. They have the annual symposium. Then there is a committee between IRCC and francophone communities that brings all the different actors, even in education and economic and social development, together. There are the meetings among RIFs at provincial and other scales. Then there's welcoming francophone communities that I mentioned that create more opportunities and spaces, and now the newly created Observatoire that also connects with research. So this is my last slide to conclude. So I went you a bit of a history road on the origins of the RIFs that came out of the ongoing struggles of francophone communities and this paradoxical minority status where they have some financial protection compared to others, but still in an ongoing context of always needing more, never having sufficient resources, so to speak, and as a model of partnership that is really anchored deep within the community and here the sort of the very strong networks of social capital that is at the basis of this community resilience, and providing this capacity to change the structural challenges into strategic opportunities, particularly with these very deep interactions, collaborations that can lead to a capacity of transformative adaptations. This was sort of the main message, and I want to thank all the funders, including especially the three RIFs of Ontario with whom I've had the opportunity and privilege to work over all these years. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Louisa. There's a lot there. Thank you very much. And now to finish up, we're going to hear from Tara Bedard, who many of you may know. Tara is going to talk about collaboration and partnership, protesting austerity for immigrants and refugees in Waterloo Region. She is the manager of the Waterloo Region LIP. So Tara, it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here with all of you today. And thank you to Valerie for the invitation, and to John, Jill, and Louisa for sharing your expertise and your insights from all of your research. I think part of what has helped our LIP over time deal with crises and austerity is to be in a continual learning mode. So we really appreciate our research partners. So as Valerie said, my name is Tara. I know some of you, but not all of you. I am the leader of the LIP in Waterloo Region, which is in Ontario, about an hour away from Toronto. And I'm here today to now talk about some of the themes that we've heard from the research, and kind of connect that to the real world experience that we've had in the work of our immigration partnership in Waterloo Region. And so I'm going to talk about our work and how it has evolved as we have leaned into regional collaboration and partnerships to determine the future that we want in Waterloo Region for newcomers, for our regional community, for our partners, and for our LIP in the face of and in and out of crisis, economic downturn, and now austerity. We have also worked with many other LIP networks in various ways, but I'm not going to talk about that today. It's also something that really gives us strength, but today I'm focusing on very specifically the regional aspects of the work that we do. And before I go into other things, I just want to share a little bit about our community and its history. I think the context is important for the work that we're doing today. So Waterloo Region is a mid-sized community. We're currently around 700,000 people, moving quickly towards 1 million. We have 1 regional government, 3 urban municipalities, and 4 rural townships. So we have that split of urban and rural. All of the communities that make up our region were founded in the early 1800s by German Mennonite settlers, some of whom fled persecution in Russia, Ukraine, and elsewhere. Our region has a strong Mennonite community today, and it is deeply influenced by the Mennonite tradition of communal barn raising, which has come to define a strong orientation in our region towards community care, collaboration, and civic spirit. And if you've ever met other people from Waterloo Region, they will very happily tell you that in Waterloo Region, collaboration is in our DNA, and our LIP benefits from that. I would also reflect that, we had a LIP before LIPs were a thing in the IRCC sense of the word. Back probably starting in 2004, 2005, literally hundreds of business, public sector, community service leaders came together to start talking about the challenges that immigrants were experiencing in accessing our regional labor markets. From those conversations, another kind of networked initiative called the Waterloo Region Immigrant Employment Network was born. It was hosted out of one of our chambers of commerce. as a partnership initiative which involved employers and leaders from municipal government and immigrant employment-focused organizations. And it was supported by a staff team, much like a LIP is and our LIP is today. It was financially supported with provincial and business investments, and it gained momentum fast, helping employers to become future ready with the tools and skills that they needed to successfully integrate newcomer talent into their workforce. Ryan, as it was called, had really strong outcomes, but the thinking around the table over its first few years of existence was that the focus of the work needed to expand beyond just employment to be truly successful in leveraging the mutual benefits of immigration for both newcomers and our regional community as a whole. And it was exactly at this time that IRCC invited communities to apply to a new funding stream for what they called local immigration partnerships. Our region was ready, and it jumped immediately to submit a proposal within what was, I'm told at the time, a 2-week deadline. And we were one of the first 3 communities funded to begin developing what is now a local immigration partnership. From there, our story grows, and I think it shows the strength of collaboration and partnership built over time and the capacity this provides us to weather crisis and now austerity, because we have taken control of our own destiny as a regional community. My experience as I have lived through the work of our LIP also shows that our ability to weather crisis and austerity is very much dependent on the work we do in normal times. And in normal times, we do the work as a LIP in our community to build collaboration and partnership. We open doors for our partners, we promote our partners, we help form new partnerships, we support funding applications by many of the partner organizations that we work with. We help to build trust amongst organizations, and we create space for them in conversations that they want to influence in our regional community. We help coordinate services, we facilitate collaborative community and employer engagement, and we engage in coordinated advocacy. Together with our partners, we set our community priorities and we voice them in policy and investment settings. As the LIP staff, we advocate for our partners wherever we can. We have helped to establish immigration, our settlement partners, and the LIP as essential community economic infrastructure over time. That is what our work has been. And to sustain a deep regional commitment to humanitarianism, that reaches back to the very beginnings of the community. And that is very foundational to our success. In the time that I've been with the LIP, which is now 11 years, I think there are 3 moments that stand out as illustrative of some of the themes that were talked about earlier in the research, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about each of them. And the first one was a crisis, and that was Operation Syria. For those who are around when the federal government made its commitment to resettle, what they said at the time was 25,000 refugees from Syria, ended up being a lot more. I think this was the first kind of crisis response that our LIP engaged in, and it kind of forced austerity on our community in this situation, as there was a huge impact in communities as a result of that federal commitment to resettle. But as those of us who lived through it know, there was not significant funding that did flow to communities to enable the local responses. So when Operation Syria was announced, our LIP was in its 7th year. Waterloo region was one of only 39 resettlement communities at the time for government-assisted refugees. And so we knew that we would be very heavily impacted, that we needed to do things differently, and that we needed to act quickly, given the scale of operation and how quickly everything was expected to happen. Our settlement and resettlement partners in Waterloo region looked to the LIP to provide the operational leadership and coordination that was needed to, kind of meet the challenge that was facing us as a regional community. And we started immediately, bringing together about 150 leaders from across our community, from different sectors together to inform them what we were facing as a regional community. And, through an afternoon together, you kind of roughed out what a structure could look like for how we would work together. We then worked with the municipal leaders within the regional municipality where our LIP is hosted to leverage the regional pandemic plan that had been developed after the SARS crisis, which had not yet been tested in real life to activate our plan. It ended up working out very effectively for our regional community because everybody had a clear place in it, a clear responsibility, and all of those places and responsibilities were seen as important. It was also effective because no one was seen to be or actually worked alone. It created a sense of shared responsibility across resettlement, immigrant services, housing, healthcare, employment, volunteer services, and more. It provided for coordination of services, coordinated communications, coordinated community engagement to manage the tide of resident outreach, and coordinated advocacy. We used our pandemic channels to engage upper levels of government to address our community and our partner needs. And funding. We worked out community needs together at the collaborative tables within our structure. We decided together who would apply for what funding and what programs. Our LIP also launched a community fund at our community foundations, which was able to receive community donations. Residents who were not otherwise engaged were, looking for ways to support, and we received a lot of donations. And then we worked through our Immigration Partnership Council to receive requests from our partner organizations and others for funding for different pieces of work to support the refugees who are arriving and distribute that money out that had been donated into targeted programs. This coordinated partnership approach enabled us to navigate huge systems of shock, of a significant humanitarian response. And that was because of the history of the relationships and trust that we had worked to develop so far through the LIP. This crisis was also game-changing for immigration, for our settlement partners, and for our LIP in our regional community. It forced everyone to learn in much deeper ways about immigration, refugee resettlement, and all things connected. And although we had been operating for some time, the scale of this resettlement effort nationally and locally, and our pivotal role as a LIP and our settlement partners absolutely solidified the community leadership and importance of our work and our partners. It was then quiet for a couple of years when the second crisis hit our community that we've navigated in the time when I've been with our LIP, and that was the pandemic. And we've heard lots about learnings from the pandemic already today. At the time when the pandemic happened, our LIP was then in its 12th year of operation. And we were almost at the end of a strategic planning process when the whole world changed. Everyone panicked across every organization and every sector, and was trying to figure out what to do and how to adapt their operations, including all of our partners. And despite all of that and everything that was happening and the uncertainty in the world, our partners decided that the LIP was important. It would be an enabler of pandemic responses. And so was our new strategy important. And so they approved our new strategy at the very beginning of the pandemic, despite the pandemic, with all of its the priorities that had been set, not planning for a pandemic. And it has been used since to frame our quickly evolving work. And there were a few things that happened. First, when the pandemic hit and we were going to activate regional pandemic response structures, we were actually the only ones who had experience using our regional pandemic response plan because we had leveraged it in Operation Syria. And so our experience and our insights were really helpful in helping everybody else who was new coming into this structure understand how it was operating and to help to make it more effective. We were able to, we worked out a lot of kinks earlier, and so that learning was woven into the regional response. Second, our LIP was woven into that pandemic structure. We represented partners, service and grassroots organizations when they did not have the capacity to engage themselves. And we ensured that there was a seat at the table for them in pandemic groups when they did have capacity. Their issues became the focal point, actually, of regional response, how to reach those furthest from service, and those most likely to be impacted by the pandemic. This created new opportunities for partnership and relationship building with system partners, which led to very specific and targeted vaccine outreach in our regional community. Through this work, we kind of helped to position our immigrant service and grassroots partners as essential infrastructure to meet pandemic response targets. Public health had the mandate in our community, but they could not do it alone. Again, this, it all kind of worked out quite effectively in our region because everybody had a clear place and responsibility within the structure. Again, all of them were important, and everybody was clear that nobody could do it alone. We needed a shared response. We had many of the same approaches to service coordination, communication coordination, community engagement coordination, and regional advocacy when it came to policy and also funding for programs that were needed in the community. This approach enabled us to support the regional's response to a significant health crisis based on the reputation of our LIP, the history of our relationships, and the trust built through the LIP. The context of the pandemic allowed us to further entrench the important role of immigrant services, grassroots partners, and the LIP in enabling appropriate and effective mainstream programs, services, and responses. So we are no longer just important in immigration-specific settings. And now, we're kind of living through the third quote-unquote crisis facing our LIP, and that is forced austerity. Now our LIP, last year, I guess our LIP was in its 15th year, of operation, when IRCC, as our largest funder, told us that they were cutting our funding by 30%. They thought that we were too big compared to other LIPs. And without looking at why we had the investment we did or what we did with it, they immediately pulled 30% out of our budget. Again, when we got that news, we were in the middle of a foresight and strategic planning process with partners. Again, we panicked for a minute, and then we stopped and began to try to figure out what to do and how to adapt. First, our partners together decided that despite what IRC thinks about our funding and the size that we should be, our LIP is essential community infrastructure in Waterloo Region, and it must continue. We completed and approved our strategy, and we moved into it as a response to that decision that was communicated to us, a new strategic pillar, which is focused on organizational sustainability and resilience. The second thing that happened was that our host and our Immigration Partnership Council leaders began advocating immediately with IRCC to reverse their funding decision, and they continue to do so. There were some small gains from that, but there is a long way to go. The third thing that has happened is that we have really leaned into the new pillar that was brought into our strategy, focused on resilience and sustainability. Together with our partners, we have struck a new funding committee, which is led by community partners, and it began immediately to work on a diversified funding strategy for our LIP. And this, kind of builds on a lot of the conversations from the plenaries that we heard this morning. Our partners in Waterloo Region are clear that the future orientation of our community towards 1 million residents makes this work necessary. So they decided that Waterloo Region is not now ready to not have a LIP, and it will not be for some time. So they have stepped up. I have been working all year with our funding committee on municipal, charitable, business, and other investment strategies. We are working together to work towards a member contribution model. Just the other night, after the end of the first day of P2P, I was online with our partners in Waterloo Region, where they were speaking to one of our municipal councils about the ongoing need for this work and the need for their investment so that we can take the regional approach that we want to take and not one that is determined for us in Ottawa. And as the head of our Chamber of Commerce, who led the delegation, said, we are in the middle of creating a new model for how we want to continue to do this work as a community. And also importantly, and as was discussed this morning, we are looking at shared priorities and co-funding opportunities with our partners. We are building something in our community together, and we do not want to be competing with our partners for LIP resources. So we know we have, as a LIP, a new strategy and line of operations going forward for staff and for our partners, which involves a much greater focus on stakeholder relations when it comes to funding and sustainability. In our region, the LIP has been there for our partners, and they really feel ownership of it. Our partners want the LIP to continue because it adds value to their work. So they are fighting austerity for our LIP and building out the next iteration of our Made in Waterloo model. Again, we are seeing through this work that we have now started to undertake over the last year that shared ownership and responsibility and a partnership approach is enabling us to weather a situation of austerity that has been forced upon us in the middle of an economic downturn and to prepare for a new future with stronger community investment in a monetary sense to match our regional commitment overall. And I'm done.
Thank you very much, Tara. That's really interesting, and it brings together all these other presentations. I want to thank everyone. You were almost on time. I want to remind the audience, you can put your questions in the Q&A, or you can try raising your hands. I'm not sure I'm going to see the raised hands, but there is a question from Catherine Saint-Hilaire. Catherine, I'll read it out. Do you think that creating formal partnerships between LIPs and RIFs can be a way to create more resilience for the sector? And how could it happen, considering the differences between them and the shifting provincial and federal priorities? And I think this one's for you, Louisa. But after you speak, I'll let everybody else jump in.
Merci beaucoup, Catherine. I really don't. So first, I didn't go into all the details, but there is already collaboration between LIPs and RIFs. That's another. So I'm sorry, I couldn't speak about everything, and especially in Ottawa, I know the model is a lot of sharing of resources across the French-speaking and English-speaking. So this already exists. To some extent, I think it can help create more resilience, at least have a dialogue and understand, particularly for avoiding duplication of services and such, and coordinating better. And particularly, I think in Ottawa, the model of sharing resources has been very, very successful along the ways of what Tara has been saying. Nevertheless, the two immigrations are different, so they also need to have their own, work that is separate. So some is joint, some is separate. But in terms of maybe negotiating with Ottawa or IRCC, having a common front could be, or I think what Tara just said about the model of the developing, maybe LIPs and RIFs can look at that and I guess increase their autonomy in terms of not being as dependent on government funding and that. And working together. And in terms of the employment sector, for example, definitely it would be worth pooling resources because for Francophones, employment is a big issue and it's not just in the Francophone community. So just on top of my head.
Catherine, does that answer your question?
Yes. Well, I'm gonna speak in English because I think most people here will understand English, but I could do that in French as well. I think the main answer usually is yes. The second part is more like how would you imagine it? Because we do know that I just learned that the LIPs were born out of the austerity with the Harper government, and the RIFs were born out of necessity of not losing the francophone percentage, populations, and so on. So we're born on in two different angles, but we do similar things. And the idea is that we want to preserve the francophone aspects, and the LIPs also want to preserve the opportunities and the activities and the resources within the community. So we want similar things, but with different approaches. So are we ready to create some sort of formal partnership? And there has always been friction, meaning that we want the Anglophone partners, when they receive Francophone migrants, instead of counting them as their clients, as to refer them to the Francophone community to have this amazing opportunity of becoming part of the Francophone community. And as Francophones, we're trying not to attract those that pick English as their migration language to come to our service, but really to go to the Anglophone services. But we do know that clients just will pick wherever they want to pick as a service. So how do we encourage our partners to respect this idea of like choosing the English services when people are speaking English and choosing the French services? This is the main thing that Francophone partners will always have this, yes, but do they really send us their clients? And this is always something, as RIFs and LIPs, we can decide to work together. But if our partners are not ready to make the shift of like really, really working together, of course, we can decide to have a common front to request more or even to go for funding. But if the underlying is not understood, respected, or even implemented, whatever we're going to do at that level, which is not the top level, but the mid part, will never really fully work. So I do work with LIPs and I like to work with LIPs. We have similar situations. But sometimes my partners are like, I'm not going to go to that meeting if everything's in English. And then our meetings are all in French. And we need people that can speak both languages. And I just want to say, as a bilingual person, the translator of this VVP here is horrible because it cuts in the middle of nowhere and so on. So for bilingual people, this is not amazing, but we need more bilingual people. So all of this together, and I was listening to what's happening in Quebec, and we're technically not supposed to be working with Quebec organizations, but we can learn from them and so on. There's so many little details, and I'm like, how do we imagine going past it to save ourselves this austerity in a certain point? So I'm sorry I'm taking so much more time than I'm supposed to. Okay, sorry.
No. Before I ask the panelists to respond, does anybody in the audience have any suggestions for Catherine? And then I'll get to you, Mo. No?
Yes, actually, hello. So my name is Mo. I just joined recently the Ottawa Lib. So to answer Catherine, we were thinking also of the same thing, or at least I was thinking of the same thing, like how can the Francophone network and the Anglophone network, also as a bilingual person and a very, very big defender of Francophonie, how can we more work together? And I think maybe what we can do is maybe look more into how we can collaborate on our behind the scenes services. Like maybe if the meetings themselves are difficult to organize because of the language barrier, maybe we can more merge other types of services that we do. But I'm not sure how far can we go there, but like maybe something behind the scenes.
Okay. Now, I had a pretty good control over the timing of this meeting until about 8 minutes ago, and I have since lost it. So I have to admit to everyone, we are at time in about a minute and a half. So if you indulge me and are willing to stick around, we can ask first Louisa, then Jill, and then Tara and John, if they also have any comment on this, but it's going to take more than a minute and a half. And so I want to also be sure and thank the panelists and thank you for attending. So just in case we run out. So, Louisa, you get first dibs, 1 minute.
I'm passing on to, I think, Tara. I would love to hear what she has to say around this. I already spoke. So.
Okay, Tara, what do you think?
First off, I would say, so some of this is happening in more direct and less direct ways. So we do connect with the RIF in Southwestern Ontario through the Southwest Ontario network of LIPs and RIFs. And, we are there able to share about the work that we do and look at whether there are, specific ways to collaborate. That has led to, really specific joint initiatives in some communities and less so in others. And we're probably on the less so side right now. But we've been focused in Waterloo region on building our collaboration with our Francophone service partners who are operating in our region and their connection across with the Anglophone settlement services. And so, we're trying to get better at that. And then layering in collaboration with the RIFs is, another layer on top of which, we haven't gotten there yet. And so there's definitely work to do. But it is on people's radar and one thing at a time, I guess I would say.
Jill, you got any suggestions, comment?
I don't think I have anything to add to that, but nice to hear from you.
John?
Yeah, great comments. The only thing I would just add here is that part of the problem with cooperation is, of course, the hyper competitive funding model that the government has in place. And under conditions of austerity, that just becomes, more so. So while cooperation is increasingly, I think, necessary under these circumstances, it will be more difficult. But I think there's a lot of good signs that organizations are doing a lot of this work, realizing some of those longstanding challenges. And I think, we made some progress, I think, and there were some good signs and there was lessons during the pandemic. Unfortunately, they're all being sort of abandoned on the part of government about ways forward. And I think that voice needs to keep being put forward as saying there's a better way of doing this.
Can I make one closing comment? This tension between competition and competitive funding versus the sustained collaborations that go on in the background, Mo, you're quite right. People talk to each other, they know who to call, etc., is an underlying tension in the entire funding model. And I think John is also correct. I am more optimistic than him about it, that during the pandemic, yes, the funding model became less competitive, and everybody can keep asking for that. But at the same time, the creation of that social capital that Louisa kept talking about, the recognition that Jill talked about in Quebec of the contributions of giving community organizations some autonomy, these may be easier asks in the current climate. And the question is, can people get the support to keep those going? So that's the lesson I take away from all these presentations, because I think social capital does count, but it only goes so far if you can't sustain it. And what Jill points to is a model of recognition of community organizations with not very high levels of funding, but little bits of funding that allow them both to be recognized as important, but to maintain those social capital and to grow it. And on that note, I'm going to let you all go have lunch because it's quarter to 12 where it's past quarter to 12 where I am. It's past quarter to 1 where you are. And thank you very much. And I really want to thank all of the participants, but especially the panelists. And thank you for putting up with the commuter train going by outside my door. Goodbye. Thank you very much.